Look, I think this president is both the most incompetent and most ideologically extreme president I've ever seen. You've seen it in the economy. They're now trying to say 2% growth is a recovery. You see it in foreign policy where they refuse to unequivocally support Israel against Hamas. You see it where they just dithered over ISIS, allowing them to gather strength and force. You see it in the Russia now being in Crimea and Putin threatening Ukraine, knowing that he doesn't fear the consequences out of this government. The thing that concerns me the most, it's not just Obamacare and almost $18 trillion of debt and the borrowing and the EPA. It's this president trying to change the definition of the American dream.
Once upon a time, when Republican possibilities for the presidency in 2016 were mentioned, you would always find the name Bobby Jindal right there in the top 3 or 4. Then along came the Republican response to the president's State of the Union address in 2009. Governor Jindal got the call, and what he got was a media hammering for being less than oratorical. In other words, plain and simple, he blew the spotlight and was not heard from again. Until now, of course. For everything in politics is optics and redemption. So let us seek the truth as we welcome back to MidPoint former senior advisor to the U.S. State Department, now principal at the global advisory firm DC International Advisory. Also the author of Smart Power Between Diplomacy and War. Christian Whiton joins us today. Christian, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here, Ed. Thanks.
What happened to Governor Jindal that all of a sudden brings him back? Because you will have to agree with me that for a long time after that 2009 address, you rarely heard his name except on late-night television show jokes.
Well, Ed, as someone who stepped in front of a camera, you know, and I know, and anyone who stepped in front of a podium knows, you have good days and you have bad days. I can think of 2 other men who had iffy speeches at one point in time. One became the 42nd President of the United States, and one became the 44th President of the United States. But what's happened, I think, is the onset of 2016. Presidential campaigns are lamentably long, and Bobby Jindal hasn't said he's definitely running, but it's going in that direction along with a number of other people. But I think what brings him back is actually ideas. You know, we are 20 years, 1 month short of 20 years away from the contract with America. The last time I'd say the GOP really came out of the gate with a strong quiver full of ideas, and that is, I believe, what Jindal is trying to position himself as, someone who can actually bring not just governing experience as governor of Louisiana, but also a lot of new ideas, especially on energy and national security, which are in the news today.
I want to hit on something you said right there. You said quiver full of ideas. I don't think I've heard it put quite as well when it comes down to the Republicans. Is it not fair to say that Governor Jindal might actually be the smart one in all this because he sees that that quiver is fairly empty, or at least that's the perception of the American people right now, that the Republicans don't come with solid ideas and here's what we're going to do, and that may be his way back?
Yep, I think so. You know, it's always a problem when you are out of power, when you don't have the executive branch, because then your party is represented by a lot of congressmen. It's very hard to get them on the same page. Newt Gingrich did that in a very rare and unique point in history in 1994. But as we get into the campaign, and especially as you see governors step forward, people who have experience, and again, Jindal is somewhat interesting because Louisiana is both a big oil state, an energy state, a gas state. It's also close to the border. And also because Jindal was a congressman before he was governor. So he can also cover other issues that governors have a tough time with, national security. And again, we've seen some interesting ideas there as well as the energy front recently.
Do you need to make sure you've got a little harsher rhetoric, I guess, at this point? And maybe rhetoric's a tough word, but Governor Jindal has already said that Americans are clamoring for a hostile takeover of Washington, D.C. He uses that word hostile takeover, and then he goes right after the president. He really is, and wouldn't you agree that he's become much more forceful right now, and he is using language that basically is, well, very truthful, maybe a little bit earthy, but maybe that's what Americans need to hear at this point, because we do have an administration right now that just seems to enjoy putting PC comments on all their various ideas.
I think that's right, but I think it's important to go out both with a reason, a critique. I mean, why do you want power? Why should you be entrusted with power? There has to be something going wrong today, and I think, with the Obama administration, you can point to a lot, but you have to do more than just house on the president. You have to come out with positive ideas. So on energy, he came out recently, Jindal, and said that Obama taking credit for fracking revolution and energy jobs is sort of like the rooster taking credit for the dawn. A strong critique, but also an alternative plan. a plan to unlock natural resources on public lands, to have sort of a one-stop shop for permitting, of course, to approve Keystone XL and other steps. And by doing that, according to a PricewaterhouseCoopers study, you can add something like $1 trillion to the economy and potentially 1 million new jobs over a decade. And specifically looking at household income, which has been stagnant through both Democratic and Republican administrations, trying to up that number by 7%, which would happen if you created 1 million new jobs. So things like that, a critique, but also an alternative.
Let's also look at some of the numbers here, because I found this interesting. When we're talking about Bobby Jindal and his resurrection, AOL, America Online, actually talked to some of the voters recently. They asked a number of people who you would vote for right now in 2016. This was astounding, really, in some ways. Mitt Romney got 13%. Okay, got it. Hillary Clinton, 26%. But 61% of the people who were talked to, this is 51,000 people, and 61% said anyone else. If it's Governor Jindal or anybody else right now, isn't it really good to be in that 61% at this point, because maybe you're not seen as being part of the quote-unquote establishment? Is that where you have to attack from now?
With early polls, it often seems to be an exercise in name recognition. And of course, you're seeing this on the Democrat side, which also looks like it's going to have a competitive race, and perhaps one that's not constructive for them, one basically that pulls them farther to the left, whereas Republicans can have primaries, hopefully, that bring out and cultivate new ideas. But I think you're right. If you look also state by state, New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina, Florida, who plays well in those? And if you look at sort of the list of the slate of would-be Republicans, again, I think governors who are relatively fresh faces, not completely new, are going to fare better than Washington insiders like senators or some of the names that we've been hearing really for the last decade or so, including some who've already had their chance at bat.
Do you have to insult people? And I have to ask you that when you look at some of the things that he has said and others have said. But here's Bobby Jindal. We have a president who is disturbingly naive and holds a dangerous utopian view of the world and the dangers therein. That's pretty harsh. Some people would take that as an insult. You're basically calling the president, the chief executive, naive. But we really see a lot of this, don't we, anymore? It doesn't make a difference if it's Bobby Jindal or anyone else. They now take very open shots at the president, things that maybe 10 or 15 years ago you never would have heard somebody say, because it works, doesn't it, Chris?
Well, my rule of thumb on negative campaigning is, first of all, it has to be true. But second of all, it's actually essential, especially for Republicans. When it comes to attacking Republicans, the media will always do that job on behalf of the Democrats. If you want something negative pointed out about the Democrats, often you as the candidate have to do that yourself, because you're the only one with the microphone and the platform that can do that. So you have, a situation, I think, where Bobby Jindal has come out and said that President Obama, is against American exceptionalism, and I think it's very hard to deny that if you look at what he has said and look at what he has done in the world. So I think being negative on some respects is essential.
And you look at what Jindal is doing right now, but is maybe one of the most important things, you touched on this briefly, is to make sure you're not giving ammunition to that media and to the Democrats. When you look at what Rick Perry is going through right now, it really seems to many people that for whatever reason, the right consistently is just handing the ammunition over to the left, and that's the biggest thing. If you can keep yourself clean and keep the ammunition out, you can basically say whatever you want. Just don't give them something to hammer you on. Maybe that's the one thing that caught Jindal after the 2009 speech. He's got to make sure it doesn't happen to him again.
It's important not to make unforced errors, of course, but I do think that there is a risk of playing things too safe, which many politicians do. And frankly, I think Mitt Romney did through much of the 12 campaign, including when he had the chance to hammer President Obama on Benghazi. Not only failed to do that, but basically had his lunch eaten by Candy Crowley, the CNN moderator, who sort of ruled in favor of Obama incorrectly. So I do think you have to get out there and do things. With Rick Perry, that's not really an error on his part. That's a politically motivated assault from a highly partisan prosecutor who incidentally went to jail for 45 days for a felony. These things do happen, and I think voters will keep them in perspective. But the most important thing, I think, especially at this stage, when you're trying to distinguish yourself from a crowded field, is to get out and actually put some ideas out there and remind people of your governing experience.
So about 30 seconds left here. Let's bring this back full circle here. Do you believe, would it be your opinion, that Bobby Jindal is indeed, if he wants to be, back in the race and can get back in the mix solidly?
I think certainly he's a contender. Also, we don't think of him as an icon of the religious right, but he is someone who has an interesting background with his own faith. He was born in the United States, but of an Indian American family, converted from Hinduism to Christianity, talks a lot about culture, but I think in a way that's inclusive and appealing. So I think he can really do a lot. It's going to come down to Rand Paul, the isolationist libertarian, versus someone else, and I think he has a decent shot of being the someone else, but it's very early.
The sifting sands of politics. I love it all the time. Christian Whiton, his book is Smart Power Between Diplomacy and War. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks. Great to be here.
All right, later on this hour, the sports league that almost dares lawmakers to stir things up with their government, and their government granted rights to make a buck. And after the break, another example of those people who perhaps should not be allowed to procreate for obvious reasons. It is their admission to Outland. Yours as well when we continue right here on MidPoint.